Hello there! Playing Von Karma here with a new episode of RBY Bytes. For the past few months, Gen 1 Unused has been in a period of flux, both tiering and metagame wise. It's always been a tier with constant changes, switching hands across multiple websites with constant debate over what should even be considered unused, but since settling into Smogon, we're seeing more gradual tier shifts, but significantly higher levels of optimization. Specifically, the normal spam team style, which involves stacking normal type Pokemon like Persian, Kangaskhan, and Dodrio onto teams, has become long and far the most dominant, with all teams requiring ways to prepare for them. This has made the tier way more offensive than it already was, and you'll thus see lots of mentions of it in this video. In May 2021, Lapras and Victreebel were scheduled to drop to UU, but were held back for just over a year when people were conflicted about how to handle rises and drops. At the time, RBY had only just begun its Smogon-style tiering, and is arguably the first of the viability-based tiering generations to truly try and create a policy around it. With these factors at play, RBY UU grappled with a balance between its status quo of excluding the two, and community interest in integrating them. They needed to be dropped eventually to be given due process, but people weren't sure about how easy it should be for Pokemon to rise and drop, and were also concerned about metagame stability. It was a mess. In June 2022, Lapras, Victreebel, and as part of a strange and temporary tiering anomaly, Slowbro, officially dropped to UU. Immediately though, they had a quick ban slate held, still having fears of metagame impacts. This kept Lapras and Slowbro away from the tier before the latter was yanked back up to OU, while Victreebel dropped cleanly.
Did I win?
However, Lapras was promised to have its due process eventually to see if it was balanced, which in hindsight was a little silly. I mean, you could just let it run around and find out, right? Anyway, the point is, that happened, and in November 2022, that opportunity came, with Lapras being properly legalized in the tier effectively over a year overdue. While that song and dance likely isn't happening again, or at least I hope so, it was really silly, we can now evaluate Lapras' impact on the metagame. What about Victreebel? What about Victreebel? So let's talk about Lapras. Lapras was slightly hindered by the sleep ban prior to it dropping, initially being seen as potentially fine. However, that did almost nothing to stop it from being one of the most incredible threats in RBY UU history. Lapras dominated UU on every level. Stats, move pool, everything. It took every single bulky water type in the tier, and merged them all into one big super threat, effectively making all the others redundant. Vaporeon, Dewgong, Armor-Star, and even Gyarados are plainly outclassed by Lapras. Having access to perfect coverage and gigantic bulk, Lapras wasn't just a Tentacruel check. You could arguably call it a counter, forcing Tentacruel to try and pivot out with Wrap and winning 1v1s it should not. This was enough for Tentacruel to drop below 100% usage in tournaments for the first time in years. Few Pokemon were capable of 2-hit KOing this behemoth of a Pokemon, and with Blizzbolt coverage, nothing could beat Lapras in a straight 1-on-1, except itself. If you think electric types like Magneton and Raichu are good picks against it, while it did rise in usage, they failed to switch to Lapras effectively at all, and could lose for trying if Lapras were to try and stay in. Grass types weren't safe either, having to play 50-50s between Thunderbolt and Blizzard. Life and death. With Lapras being able to take so many wraps from Dragonite and Tentacruel, them not being nearly enough to bring it to KO range reliably, it would overwhelm the tier through sheer bulk. It is notable that older forms of offense in Unused also became far less viable or otherwise had to be redefined. Many players prior to Lapras' drop would use Articuno as a strong game ender, with its Nuclear Blizzard forcing everyone to play around it. It's also among the few Pokemon that can stave off normal spam safely, acting as an emergency check if need be. Lapras' quadruple Blizzard resistance and absurd bulk, as well as its utility against normal types, significantly hit Articuno's viability, severely impacting an entire team style. Before, bulky water types wouldn't always be on teams, and most would take meaningful damage from Articuno's double-edged Hyper Beam, but this absolutely did not apply to Lapras, which could even respond with Thunderbolt. As a result, Articuno's position as the cornerstone of offense was deposed, but surprisingly, it wasn't out yet. Teams featuring Articuno had to force a Lapras mirror early, something of extreme risk that could end up losing the play of the game, depending on what the opponent had. Ergo, these teams had to be built around having a backup strategy against Lapras to be successful. If this worked, Articuno would end up much further ahead, no longer having any bulky water types to contend with. This was further bolstered by Tentacruel's decreased usage, which Articuno previously had to take extreme risks to take down. Overall, once the Lapras Mirror concluded, teams were often extremely unprepared to face Articuno, usually crumbling outright. So while Articuno was no longer an offensive centerpiece, it became a strong auxiliary offensive threat instead. Some players tried to use Moltres for its more favourable type shot, thanks to the bulky water types merging into Lapras. Being able to hit Lapras neutrally and benefiting from the mirror match in a similar manner to Articuno, in theory, could have led to Moltres rising to UU in Articuno's place. While this didn't catch on, I personally think it was very unexplored and built a ton of teams around this theory in the months prior to Lapras' ban. I'll flash a few on screen right now. All things considered, Lapras ended up having only itself as a reliable counterpick. Hell, people began to run Confuse Ray on their own Lapras just to cheese their way through the mirror match, which was just disgusting if you ask me. Even without Confuse Ray, because these mirrors often hinged on speed ties with Thunderbolt, they would be extremely volatile. More often than not, one Lapras would either paralyze or land a critical hit on the other. If either happened, the player would likely win the game just off the sheer amount of remaining HP. Because Lapras has no answer, the player to come out on top of the inevitable Lapras mirror was supremely better off. Lapras ended up taking the bulky Water type slot, countering every other Water type with its Thunderbolt, and thus got goaded into fighting itself, which ended up making for a far more offensive tier. Naturally, as the tier becomes more offensive, normal types like Persian, Kangaskhan and Dodrio, which were already becoming overwhelming, were bolstered even further. Not to mention they were among the only Pokemon that revenge killed Lapras. Dragonite, the only Pokemon that could consistently switch in and threaten a Thunderwave from these normal type behemoths, saw a massive rise in usage, in addition to its utility in safely bringing Lapras into consistent Thunderbolt 2-hit gear range. Pretty much everyone knew Lapras was going to be unbalanced. With the name of tiering, it got its due process, and soon enough, discussions arose about how to suspect test it, this time more democratically. Tournaments were held, including underused Farm Premier League 3, LTC Tour, Ancient Lower Tiers Premier League 1, and the Ruins of Alph Spotlight Tour of 2022, all of which featured the newly tiered UU. From these tournaments, arguments arose that one Pokemon was actually more unbalanced than Lapras. And that's Hypno. Indeed, despite previous surveys preferring Hypno stay in the tier, the community opinion effectively did a U-turn, with a lot of drama coming on about it actually. Hypno had been in RBY underused ever since the first time BL was abolished in 2011, that's 12 years, and has consistently been one of the most dominant Pokemon in the tier. It's not hard to see why. It's the bulkiest psychic type in the tier, being head and shoulders above most Pokemon available, and has access to sleep, paralysis, and the perfect coverage. Truly, the sole thing keeping this monster from being banned in the past was arguably just poor optimization. Hypno is the true essence of a tank. It takes hits, and when it hits back, you're losing well over a third of your HP, and likely getting paralyzed. Some people have argued for Hypno ban since around late 2020, most notably Hitmonlee, but the overall player base was averse to it up until recently, believing that its defensive profile was necessary for the tier's continued existence. At the time, teams were more defensive and usually contained a bulky water type, allowing Hypno to focus more on rest sets. The reason this opinion died down was due to Hypno's ability to trade hits becoming more favoured, and rest sets declining in viability due to the encroaching dominance of a normal spam team style. With this occurring, Hypno had been identified as a far better offensive Pokemon, using its hit trading ability to overwhelm multiple Pokemon through straight one-on-ones, often carrying multiple per game. The normal types can't take its Psychic well, and Hypno could take more than a single hit, so it just became one of the best ways to handle them. Hypno played a significant role in the suspect testing of Sleep in RBY UU in September 2022. Honestly though, I'd argue that Sleep would never have been tested without Hypno's use of it. Hypno was the one sleeper capable of running sets with and without the dreaded Hypnosis, and because it could only truly be answered by your own, it resulted in an extremely one-sided game state once it got stuck to the field, especially if your own Hypno lacked Hypnosis. If your Hypno gets put to sleep, your main answer to theirs is gone, so you'd often need to sack something and then try to win a one-sided mirror match, as it's likely your follow-up Pokemon will be paralyzed and take massive damage when switching in next. The only alternative is to pray Hypnosis misses, and then gamble on a speed tile with your own inaccurate Hypnosis next turn. It was all around miserable. This set had previously dipped in and out of usage, but at its peak, it was seeing a ton, which led to criticism of the tier basically being a slot machine. You can't really scout for sleep moves in RBY, because once it hits, you're down a Pokemon. Plus, Hypno was normally the first Pokemon to use either status, with Sleep always being prioritized first to stop players from blocking it with a paralyzed Pokemon. So if they had Hypnosis, you wouldn't know it until it happened. However, once Sleep was banned, it didn't really solve anything. While yes, the Hypnosis Hypno mirrors were gone, the lead metagame shifted massively into its favour. Without lead Hypno having to fear a counter lead Venusaur that could shut down its Hypnosis, the main method of leading Pokemon was to either bring a hugely offensive normal type to try Coercive immediately, or bring a Paralysis Inducer for early status progress. The Pokemon that deals with both of these best is, well, Hypno. Hypno is a Pokemon that can use Counter or Thunder Wave against the normal types, doesn't mind paralysis much, and has a nuclear psychic to get off amazing damage early to boot. In the end, a significant amount of leads ended up just becoming Hypno. The metagame became more centralized than it did before. With such amazing matchups across the board, all roads arrive at lead Hypno. What about lead Tentacruel? I hear you scream. So here's the thing. Tentacruel ideally wants to wrap Hypno into Surf range here, hoping Hypno leaves out of impatience or fear of being brought to KO range for something else. However, the math isn't in Tentacruel's favour despite what it seems. While you can wrap it and delay the Thunder Wave, there isn't much disincentivizing Hypno from just staying in and waiting for a miss. Personally, I think it's actually incentivized to at least try this, because once Tentacruel is paralyzed, it's effectively dead weight for the rest of the game. Without Tentacruel's trusty speed, it drastically reduces the tempo of the rest of its party, and can't lock down endgame scenarios at all, as all its hinges on its fast wrap. Forcing Hypno out of wrap only works against the impatient players, or those who are bringing counter to have a panic button against something like Kangaskhan and are afraid of being chipped into Hyper Beam range. Otherwise, it's a very reckless maneuver. Lead Tentacruel see a steep drop in opinion as of late, primarily because of this problem. Why risk the king of a tier like this? It makes much more sense to be conservative, as Tentacruel needs minimal status progress to become the offensive force it's known to be. As a result, once again, all roads arrive at lead Hypno. During 2023, because of its new theory, which was ironically predicted by Hypno the years prior, Hypno ended up becoming the premier lead in the tier, and well, it was proven to be just as effective in practice as it was in theory. Lead Hypno ended up with win rates consistently over 50%, something that is very abnormal in Pokemon, always eclipsing Tentacruels. This meant that now, most Yu-Gi games will begin with a Hypno Mirror, which would begin with Thunder Wave and end with whichever wins the speed tie and doesn't experience full paralysis the best. Seem familiar? Indeed, in practice, this is the same problem we have with Lapras, and we have both in this tier. Hypno Mirrors were seen as profoundly uncompetitive, arguably to a worse extent than Lapras. You just replace Sleep with occasional instances of full paralysis. In trying to reduce Hypno's variance, it just became prolonged, and thus even more variable. Because of this development, players proposed that not just Lapras, but also Hypno, see its ultimate test. Not just any players either. High-level competitors like Joian, Tree69420, and Lush all proposed that they both get the axe, arguing that if Lapras is to be banned at all, Hypno, being of an equal power level, should be there as well. As a result, rather than the initially proposed Lapras test, Hypno was also put on the docket, leading to a ranked choice voting slate of either banning both, banning one or the other, or doing nothing. The opinion of banning both won by a landslide, with very few deciding otherwise. The outcome of this test has a lot of implications. The lead metagame is indisputably going to diversify, but we're also likely to see the overall landscape return to what it was prior to Lapras' arrival in the tier. Thus, expect to see a lot more Tentacruel. Normal spam is likely to be extremely happy to see Tentacruel's viability increase, as bulky wall types trying to check it can't set up to repeated normal type onslaughts, and would want its own Tentacruel to act with impunity later. However, Tentacruel's usage will probably not be as high as prior to Lapras' arrival, so not 100%. In Tentacruel's drop from usage, extremely offensive teams began being played way more effectively, and these teams are great at keeping the opponent off Tentacruel without using one themselves, Lapras or no Lapras. However, 100% dropping to 90% or so probably isn't that big of a change. With Hypno gone, it's likely that these team styles will become even more effective. I personally think Clefable is going to replace Hypno on teams that Hypno used to be the lead on, having very similar qualities, just with less disgusting bulk and not as much offensive power. It saw minute usage before this, but with its worst matchup with Hypno being gone, I can definitely see it rising to unused with time. With Hypno, the main perpetrator of Sleep's overbearing nature Yu being banned, some players are also arguing that Sleep should return to the tier. I'm unsure if this is the right choice to make. It's certainly less powerful, yes, but Clefable has Sing and could definitely repeat the sins of Hypno for one. There's also the problem of Unused itself being an extremely fragile tier, often requiring players to build teams with 6 Pokemon cores, which results in few ways to actually sacrifice the Pokemon to Sleep, like in Overused, without seeing that entire team fall apart. In Overused, you have the big 3 to rely on at all times, and your last 3 Pokemon can often function independently, which makes Sleep far less impactful. The difference here is just staggering. Sleep is also arguably necessary in Overused, keeping the tier far less bulky, and chances of weak attacks ensure that waking up is always at least remotely possible. In Underused, whenever you see a sleeping Pokemon, you can just throw out Kangaskhan against it and begin ripping into the opposing team, and sometimes even win from there, just because you got him without taking any damage. It's also notable that it's very uncommon for both players to end up with successful sleep in a Yu-Gi-Oh environment, as it usually ends up with mirrors, just because of how lines end up. In OU, both players end up landing sleep all the time, because the users are just bulky and fast enough to find opportunities. It wasn't necessarily just Hypno that was causing the problem in Yu-Yu. It's more complicated than that. The environment just isn't really compatible with sleep. Otherwise, Hypno would have been banned a year ago with ample community support. Overall, I'm glad to see the back of these two Pokemon. As much as I adore them design-wise, they just aren't cut out for lower tiers, being far above their power level. I do think that more tiering is necessary for Underuse to progress into a tier that everyone can enjoy, but it's good to see that the lower tier renaissance of the 2020s has led to better games that see tournament play on a regular basis. Before I head off, I noticed that some of my viewers don't know that I have a Discord server. If you want to keep track of my videos, look at projects I'm working on, or just see me ranting about silly things, you can join us at discord.gg/karmacord. With that, this was Playing Von Karma, and I'll see you all next time.